Hello, and welcome to the first GentrifiNation podcast. My name is Neil Baker.
I'm Daniel Rosario.
And we're here talking to the great Brett Scott, who we've seen described as, well, in your own words, you've worked as a broker, a barman, and a blues musician, which is sort of a great little title to have.
That's a catchy title.
Yeah. And whose latest book is called A Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. We're here to get a sense of, well, Brett's been in the squatting scene, am I right?
Well, I have some affiliation with it.
Yeah.
I don't claim to be a squatter, though.
No, exactly. But was it an interesting sort of trajectory from broker to, well, how would you describe yourself now?
How do I describe something now? So, I guess I work freelance helping campaign groups with issues around the financial sector, mostly. Mm-hmm. But also do journalism and stuff. I guess actually mostly I spend my time exploring economic systems. So in quite an anthropological way. So I happened to explore the financial system for 2 years as a broker, which was quite interesting. But now I explore other things as well. So
you're kind of putting a human face or humanizing financial.
Yeah, exactly. But not only the financial sector, but trying to move to other things now as well. So I experiment with like various alternative forms of finance and alternative ways of doing exchange, and seeing what I like about them, what I don't like about them, and then I'll to actually survive, to make any cash out of it, I have to like maybe sell that as journalism, or else be a consultant or something. So I kind of do that, but my primary interest is mostly just in kind of exploring that stuff.
So did you actually, when you actually went into the financial industry as a broker, was that quite specific, almost anthropological?
Yeah, I'd studied anthropology actually.
So you embedded yourself in there?
Yeah, I mean it wasn't anthropological in the sense of like an academic study. It would probably be more accurately described as a bit like gonzo journalism, which is more. So traditional anthropology, you have somebody who kind of does participant observation, where they sort of participate, but also it's kind of taking notes at the same time.
Right.
And it's sort of, and everyone kind of knows there's a studying process happening. Whereas if you push that a bit further, you get to something it's more kind of like a quasi. A bit more like gonzo journalism, where somebody just doesn't even really attempt to kind of be objective about something. You kind of immerse yourself. So that's what I was doing in the financial sector, because I come from a very sort of alternative background.
Do you want to tell us a bit about you? Because you grew up in South Africa, am I right?
Yeah, grew up in South Africa. And I mean, the South African scene's a bit different to the UK thing, but basically in terms of my background, be more ecological, environmentalist type stuff. Playing lots of bands, was very influenced by Marxist history. So I was doing anthropology and history, and the sort of anthropology side is all about studying kind of human relations at a sort of quite small scale. Often, histories have got a more of a broader sweep of the world, looking at it from bigger processes and. So that's a lot of sort of radical kind of literature and stuff that influenced me a lot in the way I was thinking. And then from that kind of backdrop, I kind of moved to the international development world, which is looking at how do you help developing nations. And so I guess my trajectory was going towards working in an NGO or working for some kind of humanitarian thing. But I guess I sort of rebelled against it because I was a bit skeptical of a lot of the NGO world. And wanted to do something different. So I sort of, long story short, I designed a kind of weird experiment to infiltrate into the financial system.
How did you fit in, with that environment? Bearing in mind you've been playing in bands and all the rest of it, and then did you have to suit up? And
yeah. So I actually wrote a whole different book about this, which hasn't yet been published, but hopefully one day it'll be published. So I actually wrote it before my current book. Which is interesting. So my first idea was to publish this book about what it's like to try and infiltrate the financial sector. And yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's like I had to sort of cut my hair and buy a suit and do. I mean, there's loads of hilarious stories around that. I mean, they were like, it was ridiculous what I was trying to do because I had no idea of anything about finance at all. So just these like ridiculous interview situations where I was like kind of like laughing at the guys who were interviewing me because I had a sense of what I was doing, but they obviously would take me very seriously. So that's yeah, it's quite a long story, all that stuff. But I mean, I ended up getting hired by actually a really interesting company. It was a startup company.
Okay.
So I'd actually been for interviews like a massive investment bank, Lehman Brothers, like a few weeks before they went bust.
Wow.
And actually I had 2 interviews there, and they were about to collapse. Although they didn't really know this at the time. And then they actually did collapse. So I was trying to get a job at quite a weird time in the financial sector, but I actually ended up getting employed by this little startup company, and that was quite interesting because of a small team trying to stay afloat in the middle whilst the financial sector was imploding.
What was it called?
It was called Hall Capital Markets. You won't find it nowadays. It went bust a couple of years ago.
Okay.
A little while after I left. But it was basically people from a bunch of the banks and stuff who were trying to start up their own company. And which is what was happening a lot during the financial crisis. People were being thrown out of banks, and they're like, okay, well, we'll just try to start up our own things. So that was quite an interesting experience. But yeah, I mean, that's what I was. But all the time I was working in the sort of derivatives world, I was maintaining, because I was working in derivatives, which are these big financial instruments. But I maintained ties with a lot of the radical communities at the same time, which was another very fascinating thing to do. Actually, speaking about squatting and stuff, I mean, I've been at sort of squat events.
I was thinking about it. So you moved over here after university, after Cambridge, that you came to the?
No, I went back to South Africa before then.
So where did you find accommodation quite easily and stuff, or did you resort to some of the alternative?
South Africans have a way when they arrive in London. There's a whole network of other South Africans, like a lot of international diasporas. It's kind of there's this. You arrive in London, and then there's a bunch of people that you know who live. And actually, in London, you find that in southwest London for South Africans. Rains Park, Wimbledon, Southfields, a whole bunch of them.
Yeah.
So you can stay on people's couches for a few weeks. So I stayed on about 4 different people's couches, but then I got a spot in Brixton in 2008. So from that perspective, I witnessed the whole of Brixton's change.
Yeah.
And the reason why I went to Brixton was because I didn't want to actually be in the sort of middle of the South African crew in southwest London, because I was like, if I'm going to be in a different country, I must live with different people. You know?
That's what you're saying.
Yeah, so it's like, and I knew a South African mate of mine who had said, hey, Brixton's cool, like you should maybe go live there. And so I just wandered up there one day and I found it. And then some guys I knew from university were also looking for a spot, so we got a spot there. So that's kind of how I came to be there. But I mean, yeah, what originally actually drew me was more that it was like it actually seemed a bit more like South Africa to me than other places. It had more of the markets and kind of like I just automatically quite liked it.
It does have that or did have that informal atmosphere. My friend used to.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that sort of takes us quite neatly into the gentrification topic then.
Well, it depends. If you want to go into that, I mean.
Well, I suppose. Well, I mean, have you seen, like you say that you even saw changes from back then? Like, when was it?
2008.
And do you still live there now?
No. So I lived in Brixton until last year. But the landlord raised our rent 25% twice. So that was it. So now I'm in Camberwell.
Oh, there you go. Well, then I guess you've seen it firsthand then,
Yeah, but interestingly, I mean, I lived in probably about 5 different houses in Brixton. So I moved from house to house. So I had one house for a year with those guys I was originally living with, and then they went off to do other things, and then I just went on to Gumtree and started moving in with random people. Who you'll find, I guess, lots of people in London maybe do this. And so I looked for a short stay. So like people who were away for 6 months who needed somebody to like, stay in their room. So I've stayed in like a bunch of different houses. So 2 other houses in Brixton, one in West Norwood.
But I mean, those rent rises are a reality for loads of people in Brixton at the moment who rent, because as you can see, even just looking at Brixton Market over the last few years, I mean, when my dad lived here in like the 70s, it was a market, and now it's got the kind of...
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, so when this house I moved into after I lived, my first house in Brixton, so my second house in Brixton, I was living with these guys who had been there for about 8 years. So they had actually been, I guess, in a prior wave of... and they were from Italy.
Yeah.
And they were kind of like this Italian musician, an Italian designer, and then a guy who did sort of bike. He's a courier guy. Bike delivers parcels.
Oh yeah.
So and they, even then, like in 2008, they were like stuff's shifting a bit, and because they had obviously been there several years before, but then so I saw it then, and yeah, I guess I had quite a few interesting experiences in Brixton over the years with that, because like the next house I lived in, again, like lots of immigrants. It was a house lots of immigrants passed through. So I was there was a Polish guy, Somalian girls living there, and it was sort of just people would be shifting and changing. And then I got involved in organising the Brixton street parties. It's called Mail Road Street Party, which actually were a couple of squats on Mail Road. But as part of that, I went to actually go and try and raise money from people on the street on Mail Road. And Mail Road's actually one of the real, there's like a lot of old school Brixtonites who lived on Mail Road, and they actually got quite a lot of interesting stories from back in the day of Brixton.
What kind of thing?
Well, I mean, so actually, I mean, Brixton has obviously been like, there were prior waves of different forms of immigration in there. Like, I guess you had the original kind of Afro-Caribbean immigration, which was, I think, in the 1940s or something. But then in the 1960s, I think 1970s maybe, there was this whole wave of like, I'm trying to think how to describe these guys. You still find them in Brixton. They hang out at certain pubs, in particular the Prince Alfred pub, I think, on Cold Harbour Lane. You still find them. This is like one of the last outposts of the original, I guess, 1970s Brixtonites. Kind of like punk era, quite rough in terms of people who like viewed themselves as being quite like hardy, like living by their wits. Because I guess to move to Brixton at that time was probably considered to be quite out there for a lot of people. I mean, as far as I can pick up. So actually quite a big squatting community, lots of people who are like a bit on the outskirts of society. And you still find them around there. Actually, there's a guy called Tiger Matthews who you should speak to if you want to talk to about that. He's on Twitter, you can find him. He's part of the original Brixton squatter crew, who and sort of saw all kind of like some of the dark sides of that as well, the kind of the gangs involved and stuff, and like and there's another guy, so these 2 dudes actually took me into their house when I was doing this fundraising, these 2 old Irish guys, and they were like, they'd been part of this original squatting crew, anyway, according to Tiger Matthews, actually these guys are actually quasi mafioso type figures. But nowadays you see them hanging out in Brixton Market. They sit in one of the shops there and they just drink coffee and they like watch people. But they back in the day apparently they were these sort of badasses.
Right. No names in that case. Exactly. They want to get into libel.
Yeah, but they were sort of showing me like they on Mail Road. So these 2 dudes that they had all these old photos from Mail Road and stuff back. When they were hosting these illegal sort of street parties, and they ran something called the Frontline Club, which was some kind of like jazz club thing, which was bombed out during the riots. And they had loads of stories. If you get hold of those guys, they could probably tell us interesting stuff. But so that was kind of I had quite a few interesting experiences with meeting people from the old Brixton.
Yeah.
Or I guess, the 1970s Brixton. And then I guess the sort of wave of people I was sort of part of, I guess, was kind of more of like the guys I was living with and the Italian guys were more sort of, I guess, immigrants who had come in from other countries but who felt quite sort of alternative, were looking for quite cheap places but liked the vibe of Brixton.
Yeah.
And I guess I sort of felt a bit like them. And now the last wave of gentrification in Brixton is a very different character to me. It's noticeably different.
How would you describe it?
Cupcake shops and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's a cupcake revolution thing. But it started happening. I think 2012 was when it happened. It's a very subtle thing. You can feel it changing. Like it goes from a point of when I first moved to Brixton, there was very much a notion of people like, whoa, you live in Brixton, that's pretty like. Ooh, I don't know if we can want to come to your house. Yeah. Now, of course, that's completely unheard of. Like that's within a space of 5 years.
Yeah.
And the actual shift, the sort of psychological balance changed in 2012, and it was related to. You'll hear people talk about Brixton, the arcade. It's called Brixton Village, and also when they sort of did up the kind of square. They sort of cleaned the whole square up, and there was also another thing which was related, which was the clearing out of the drug dealers. Right. There was a big police crackdown. I think it was 2011 or something, where they just went and I remember they actually cordoned off the entire street and basically arrested all the drug dealers. Yeah. Now you still find that because they basically used to be just open selling on the streets. I mean they're kind of still there, but it was definitely cracked. Yeah. And that's kind of those three things. So the cracking of the drug dealers, the removal of some of the sense of the risk, plus the introduction of this kind of regeneration project, and then sort of some of the beautification has kind of like those are sort of three elements which are still. That's
nice. We might have a cheese and champagne shop, I think.
Yeah, in the market, Brixton.
Yeah, champagne.
Yeah, so I mean that's there's a lot of interesting dynamics around. I mean the Brixton Village is now kind of a real site of. For people who are aware of it, it's a real site of contention. A lot of people who arrive in Brixton who have never been there before probably don't notice it. It's probably like, oh, this is cool. It's just like a bit like, when I first arrived in London, I went to Camden and I was like, oh, Camden's cool. It looks awesome. But you probably find that people who've been living there 10 years before would be like, oh, these fucking assholes who like coming to Camden now and stuff. Yeah. So I guess you only notice the stuff when you haven't experienced. But yeah, the Brixton Village is very, very much. It's a kind of a symbol of inequality in Brixton now, and it's very noticeable, the segregation compared to what it used to be.
Is there? Can you sense the tension between?
I can, yeah, but I don't know. A lot of people can't because they don't necessarily have any other context. Yeah. I don't know if I imagine it, but I definitely sense tension. Yeah, and you hear things. I mean, I've got quite an anthropological view in the world. I often watch people and listen to stuff, little conversations and things. And there's a certain way. So in Brixton, this is going to sound weird, but you used to walk down the streets, right, and you find all these little informal shops inside the little cracks in the wall, in between two different shops. There'll be somebody who set up a stall inside those, selling CDs and stuff, and you find these congregations of Afro-Caribbean guys who would kind of hang out there and do stuff. And at that time, those guys pretty much it felt like their territory. It felt like they had some kind of pre-existing right to the area. You no longer feel that. There's very definitely a sense that they're kind of on the back foot. And you kind of notice it in the way they actually look at people now as well. There's a sense of a bit more defensiveness and aggression, which is just it's almost scowling at people, which I didn't really notice before. And that might be my imagination, but I sort of sense that.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
If you sense it, you sense it. I think with things like that, you can't second guess something like that. If you get a sense of it, then there must be something that you're basing it on.
Yeah. So, of course, it could also be me projecting my own kind of lack of contentment. Well, I mean, it's one of the decisive changes that's happened in Brixton, and this will apply to any kind of gentrification situation, I imagine, is what you have is a shift between, in my mind, people who contribute to culture and those who consume it as a product. There's definitely a sense when you first arrived in Brixton, back in 2008 when I was there, and I didn't really have any sort of. I felt very much like an immigrant in London, and actually Brixton felt quite sort of welcoming in a way because there seemed to have a lot of other immigrant communities there, and it seemed to be kind of a place where outsiders were sort of. People kind of tolerated each other as outsiders. There's lots of different groups living alongside each other. They don't necessarily like each other, but they kind of tolerate each other, and they actually there's certain respect between the different types of groups there. So between, say, like the Turkish guys and then like the Rusty guys, so there's like this kind of. So it seemed to be a community of immigrants, and part of its kind of vibe was all about people individually contributing something to the overall. Sort of contribute to it. So actually, even like say my Italian housemates, they had this kind of alternative edge. He was like a jazz musician, played down at the local pub, sort of walked through the streets and kind of gave it a sort of unique feel. It was like, kind of like so almost like producing some kind of culture, and adding to something rather than taking away anything. And I guess that's kind of sort of been Brixton's undoing to some extent, and I guess all these places where. To some extent, that becomes quite attractive to outsiders. And now what you found is there's a lot of culture consumption, where people come in and they almost watch Brixton from these little outposts. And you can actually name the outposts. It's the Ritzy. There's a number of them. These places,
cinema, the Ritzy
where people will watch Brixton from, a bit like tourists do. And I kind of, to me, there's this slightly parasitic element to it, which is kind of like culture consumption without adding anything to it. And so part of adding to the culture is that you really need to feel as a person that you actually have something to contribute, and that you really feel that there's a reason that you're there, because then you feel part of a community, and you actually, it's quite authentic. Like you don't. That's kind of how the community originally felt, but now there's this sort of sense of this creeping commodification. Which the actual shops buy into by sort of like presenting themselves to new customers, but also like in people's minds there's this commodification going on where people almost think of themselves in the third person. This is going to sound kind of abstract, but in a way people are thinking, now I'm in Brixton, rather than I happen to be in a place where there are all these people and it's called Brixton. It's like, no, I am in Brixton now doing things you do in Brixton. Which is a sort of it's a kind of an intermediary layer between the reality of what's on the streets of Brixton and your life. And this happens like in a lot of places, like in London you find it as well, and I think it's through media. It happens a lot. The more you get fed images and ideas about something, the more you have this kind of intermediary layer between you and reality.
So it's constantly in the back of your mind. I'm going to the shops in Brixton.
Exactly. Whereas previously a person would have been just like, I love that little record store because I happen to be. Let's take my housemate. I'm a dude from Italy. I love reggae. There's a shop selling me reggae records. That's awesome. That used to be the reality, and that kind of sort of like fed it. And now it's this kind of sense of like, oh, it's a reggae store in Brixton.
How trendy is that?
And so there's a strange intermediary layer that's seeped in, and you can see how that's kind of. I don't know. I mean, there's a certain gentrification of the mind kind of thing there.
And it's almost like they're branding Brixton as an experience.
Exactly. So it's a kind of tourist. It's a tourist thing that you a lot of places. I mean, it's not unique to Brixton. You find it in those places. A sense of you would have had a prior idea before you start experiencing it, which you then use to mediate your experience of it.
That was the GentrifiNation podcast.